Hello out there. Good morning, everybody. Boker Tov. Good morning. So the program is going to begin in a minute. I am Mark Goldstein, Vice President of Men's Club. Thank you all for coming out today and supporting the Scholar in Residence Weekend and the Sunday Brunch. A big thank you to Mark and Randy Cohen for managing the kitchen and everybody else helping in the kitchen. Thank you to Miles Simpson for guarding us at the door and taking all of our money. Thank you, Miles. And thank you to the Men's Club team for making everything happen. I really appreciate it. So many of you have already been here all weekend and seen the other talks we've had about how to deal with friends who have opinions that we don't agree with, how even though some in the Jewish community think that only studying Torah is the best way to be close to God. In view of other teachings, it gets a little bit confusing because maybe it's better to learn Torah than to rescue an animal or take care of your family. But how to confront that and learn the reason behind that. And Shara Tolushkin does that with stories. So Shara is living in Brooklyn, raised in New York, went to Yale, and then to Harvard, and is well published in different magazines and newspapers, so Washington Post, New York Times, Vogue, and Wired magazine. And I just heard, she just spent a little bit of time with the 6th and 7th graders. It was great to hear the story about emojis and how emojis became more diverse. The vampire shouldn't always be a man. There should be a woman and maybe a child emoji for a vampire, and other things like that. And that actually ties into the talk last night a little bit about Satan and the supernatural, Dybbuk and golems and things like that. So more exciting things today from Shara. And today, we'll be hearing about God, intermarriage, antisemitism, what the 1920s Jewish advice columns called the Bintel Briefs can teach us today. So, Shara Tolushkin.
Is this on? Okay, can everyone hear me? Hey, all right, good morning. Thank you so much, Mark, for that introduction, and to all the various Marks who have been so helpful this entire weekend, and especially Mark Zuckerman, where it has, I think I said this last night, but really it's been just so lovely from the moment that I was invited by Eitz Chaim and then got to learn a little bit more about the Men's Club, to just meeting everyone here. Like, everyone's just been so welcoming, and it's just been such a fun weekend. So I think Mark is handing out, there'll be to each table a couple of examples of advice columns from the Bintel Brief. So my hope is that we'll really have a chance today and have some time to kind of look at some of these questions and argue together about how we might have answered different ones. But I want to first just give a little bit of context and overview to kind of where this advice column comes from and why I think advice columns are a particularly interesting way to look at what issues at different points in Jewish history have really animated, like what are the different questions that Jews have been asking. So this first really interested me a couple of years ago when I started writing an advice column. So first I wrote a weekly Jewish advice column, first for Tablet magazine and then for the Forward. And I was really struck by the uniformity of questions I would get from like all across the segments of Jewish communities, right? So you would have, and non-Jewish communities, right? You had people writing in who were saying like, hey, I'm in college and I have this Orthodox Jewish roommate and I'm really worried that like, I don't know, it seems like she can't do anything on Saturdays, she can't eat anything, and like, if I put up a cross over my desk, will she be offended? Or I had people writing in saying, I moved to a new place, and when I go to Kiddush after synagogue, like no one talks to me. What do I do, right? And there's these just sort of uniformity of experiences. But perhaps unsurprisingly, the questions that I got the most often were about intergenerational differences navigating around issues with Israel. And this was, right, 5-ish years ago. So as you can imagine, those questions have only become even more urgent. But I remember one day I got a question from a young man who was clearly very like left-leaning, and he was like, I'm really close with my dad. He's always been my moral guide. We agreed about everything, but then like when it comes to Israel, he seems to totally like flip. The word he used was like flip out, and I don't know what to do. So I answered the letter. I sort of talked to gave my advice, printed it, And the next day, I got 4 different emails from people, family, friends of mine, saying, "Oh my God, how could you have published our private conversation?" Everybody assumed the letter was about them. And it totally wasn't. It was an anonymous letter that I had gotten. My dad asked me if I had juiced up a conversation that we had, and I said, "No, Daddy." So I think there's so many ways that when you really look at the questions that Jews are asking. So then when I moved the advice column to the forward, which was just kind of a logistics question because I was moving from podcasting to more editorial, so whatever. I still have a great relationship with Tablet Magazine. I started then going back into the historical advice columns that was run by the Forward. And as I was reading them, I was so struck by, in some ways, these questions really animated a different world, and in some ways, they still felt so similar. So I'll give you a little bit of basis. So probably the most famous Jewish advice column that we have is called the Bintel Brief. Has anyone here heard of the Bintel Brief or read any of these letters? A little bit. Okay. Great, because they are so fun, and I hope that after this morning you might be inspired. You can buy collections of them. But so I'll give you a little bit of an overview. So the Bintel Brief was started in 1906 by Abraham Kahan, who was a writer, a Yiddish novelist. His most well-known novel is called The Rise of David Levinsky. And it was very common at that time for newspaper men to also be novelists and poets and playwrights. So there wasn't that same division between fiction and nonfiction writing that we have today. And the Jewish Daily Forward at that time was entirely in Yiddish. The Jewish community almost entirely spoke Yiddish. And it was founded by a group of unionists, union advocates, who wanted a place for Jewish workers to be able to share their stories and to report on news. And at this time, it wasn't the big paper that it was going to be by the 1920s. This was 1906. And they needed something to fill the back page, and they didn't know what to do. And some guy suggested, "Hey, I got this letter asking for advice." It was a woman whose neighbor, she believes a neighbor of hers had stolen her watch to use to go to the pawn shop because this woman had no money for food. And she was a letter. She says, "I don't want my neighbor to feel bad. I realize she's in desperate straits, but I really want my watch back." So maybe if you publish this letter, she'll read it and then just slip it back into my door, and don't worry, we can still be friends. It's like a heartbreaking letter that kind of shows you what the poverty was like. But they were like, "Well, we want to publish it, but what should we do?" So they said, "Let's start a Jewish advice column." This was a very critical time in American Jewish history, right? So as many of us know, between 1881 and 1925, 2.5 million Jews come into the US, right? And they come into the Lower East Side, and that's when we have the tenements and the sweatshops. And they need a place to sort of start to sharing their stories, to writing about the things that they want to. Another point I was going to say is it's not just about writing their stories and advocating for the workers, but it also really became a place for people together to figure out what does it mean to be Jewish here in America. And the column was a very powerful way to connect and reach out. So people would write in with stories, and they would send an editor to go verify if the situation was really quite as desperate as it sounded, so that then it was a big fundraising column, and it was a way to really create some news. So when I first started reading it, I was struck by just some of the tragic stories, and we'll look at a couple of those today. But I was also struck, as I said, by how many of these questions were about people who were struggling with faith. So many questions about intermarriage. There was so much more intermarriage with Jews and non-Jews that was happening in the 1910s and 20s than we think. Everyone was a socialist. I live in Brooklyn. I could totally relate. And there was really just this way. And so I was trying to think, why was this such a resonant time in American Jewish history? And I was thinking, and I realized that the 1920s was the last time when questions of Jewish identity in America were not motivated at all by either Israel or the Holocaust, because neither was a reality yet. It doesn't mean there wasn't Jewish persecution, right? The majority of reason we had so many Jews who had come to America was they were fleeing horrific persecution, and you see this in their letters. And Zionism was a very real question already. But at that time, the real urgent questions for the American Jews were, okay, we're in a country that finally really accepts us. People are happy to, there was a lot of social acceptance. And what does it really mean to be a Jew in the modern world. And I mean, I think the situation is a little bit different now. After October 7th, I think a lot of younger American Jews are kind of really thinking now about how to understand their relationship to Israel and in their own lives. But I think we live again a little bit in a world where suddenly what it means to be a Jew in America is kind of rooted more in what it means to be America and not necessarily the persecutions that we have of the past. So what do I mean by some of these stories? So if you have a handout, or you can look at them, I'll read them out loud. So when I say that they're really resonating with us, so one of the first stories that I looked up is in 1906. We have somebody writing, "Dear editor, I'm a Russian revolutionist and a free thinker. Here in America, I became acquainted with a girl who's also a free thinker. We decided to marry, but the problem is that she has Orthodox parents, and for their sake, we must have a religious ceremony. If we refuse the ceremony, we'll be cut off from them forever. Her parents also want me to go to the synagogue with them before the wedding, and I don't know what to do. Therefore, I ask you to advise me how to act." Okay, so what do we think? You're a free thinker, your wife's a free thinker, but her Orthodox parents want you to have an Orthodox Jewish ceremony. Curious, who here thinks that they should go along with the parents? Okay, yeah. Does anyone want to, why do you think they should have an Orthodox ceremony? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's a question of honor. Does anybody have a somewhat different rationale besides like respect for the parents? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Right, so the decisions you make now have consequences. You can always they always say sometimes it's better to regret going to something than not going to it. And so here, if you decide not to have it, you're kind of totally irrevocably changing the relationship with your in-laws. Who here thinks no, the kids should just have the wedding that they want? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm.
And identifying a way to create that family anew.
Mm-hmm.
So if the beginnings is a deference to, and obviously you don't want to be disrespectful, but if the beginnings is in deference to the way someone else wants that day to be, it casts a shadow on what the independence of that new family and new union will become.
Right. It's you're trying to establish yourself as a couple in distinction from your family, right? And this is like your first big moment of independence. Does that resonate with anyone else, or did anyone else have a different rationale? Yeah. Yep. No, I was seeing all the nods. I was seeing all the nods. Yeah. Yeah.
Two Orthodox parents saying, "I just wonder, my son and daughter-in-law are going to get married and they don't want to do an Orthodox, and I'm thinking of not going.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What should I do? Shall I go and give up my,
Right.
So the other side of the coin kind of question.
Right. That would be, and we see that because and then similarly, that's a decision that irrevocably changes how that relations. Yeah, and these are right. This was a letter written in 1906. But I'm curious, has anyone here felt like they've had friends or family that have dealt with similar questions or problems? Yeah. Yeah, and I mean this. I got letters that I actually got a lot. Oh yeah, Mark, did you have a comment? Or yeah.
Actually, David does. Just a quick comment, which is they can do both.
You can have two ceremonies. Another, actually, in addition to Israel, a category of questions I got very frequently was people planning weddings or dealing with weddings. And a big question that would come up, especially in places like New York City and Los Angeles that are so expensive, was, we've never kept kosher. My parents have never cared. I'm getting married. For some reason, this wedding has to be kosher, right? And what is going on? And why do they care? my dad's side of the family is Orthodox, but like, so what? We'll get kosher food for them. And it was just really interesting, all of these ways that people felt that weddings in particular drew out a specific type of person. And this is really a time where you see these questions of faith, and like people, this idea of being a free thinker has kind of really taken hold, and people are really trying to grapple with. So what I'd love for each table, if you turn the page to the second page, I'd love for us, I'll just give us maybe like 5-ish minutes, and I'd love for people kind of either in pairs, I don't know how many handouts we have, so you can maybe do it as a table or in pairs, for somebody to read this letter from the progressive cantor, and then I'd love for people to discuss what they think, and then we'll come back together and talk about it as a group. So it's the one that says, Dear editor, I came from Russia, on the second page. All right, so take 5 minutes and have somebody at the table read it out loud or in pairs. Oh yeah, you want me to read it out loud? Okay, sorry, new plan. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Mark. All right, so I'm going to read this letter out loud, and then I'll take 5 minutes, and I'd love for the tables to discuss, and then we can discuss it as a group. Okay, so and sorry, I was going to say, so how did our erstwhile editor answer in 1906, our free-thinking, soon-to-be-married writer? So he kind of goes with the majority of the room, which was to say, the advice is that there are times when it pays to give in to old parents and not grieve them. It depends on the circumstances. When one can get along with kindness, it is better not to break off relations with the parents. So that's an example where they're advising the person to just go along for the sake of tradition and to not annoy your parents. But questions of how to kind of really have integrity were very central. So I'll read this next question. Dear, and this one is in 1913. So a little bit later than 1906, but still very early in the 19th century. Dear editor, I come from Russia, where I was brought up by a father who was a Talmud scholar and a cantor. I took after my father both in learning and voice, and when I became a bar mitzvah, my leading the congregation in prayer made a sensation. We're taking him at his word. My name became known in many cities, and people came to me to hear me conduct services. When I turned 18, a respected man from a town near Kovno took me as a son-in-law, gave me 400 rubles and 5 years of room and board, and, with all this, a pretty daughter of 16. I moved into my father-in-law's house, ate, drank, and devoted myself to the study of Torah. I then began to talk to my wife about going to America, and after long deliberation, we left home. When we came to this country, our landslight, our brothers, or sort of our land people, like kind of the people from who had grown up in the same town as us, helped us a little bit to get settled. And when the high holy days came, I earned $180 as a cantor, leading the Musaf prayers. I began to make a living as a cantor, and people began to hire me for weddings, funerals, and other affairs. As time went on, my horizons broadened. I read all kinds of books, accumulated worldly knowledge, and began to look at life differently. In short, I can't reconcile myself to continue making a living as a cantor, because I am no longer a believer. I can't act against my conscience, and the right thing to do is to give up my present religious livelihood. I simply want to learn a trade now, perhaps become a peddler or find other means of earning a living that would have no connection with religion. Now there are arguments over this among me, my wife, and our close friends, and we all decided to place the question in your hands. All right, so without looking at the answer, let's take a few minutes and discuss among yourselves, what would you advise our non-believing cantor? All right, let's wrap up our comments and we'll come back together in a few seconds. All right, thanks you, everybody. All right, we'll come back together in discussion. It's great to hear everybody thinking through the issues. Okay, so who here, hey, thank you. Sorry, that was my professor voice. All right, who here feels some sympathy for the cantor? Yeah, okay, almost everybody. Right, like I think there's something very sort of movingly pious about his question. Because, right, it almost speaks to a time when people really had faith and really came to synagogue because they believed in it. So who here feels that he would be justified in continuing to work as a cantor? Yeah, can I ask you to share?
I think he should make the decision based on whether he's still enjoying the work, enjoying the role, enjoying the music.
I think we are Israel. We are struggling with God. So maybe he had a little crisis in his own belief, but that doesn't mean that you throw out the baby with the bathwater. You kind of think about what it is that I'm struggling with. I would have talked to maybe a good friend or rabbi to kind of bounce off what it is that really is bothering me, because it's too of a black and white situation.
Right, just because now he has doubts doesn't mean suddenly that's the end of the story. And who knows, he's very likely leading a congregation with people who also might have doubts. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I know you're... Okay, great, sorry, I will follow the microphone, but yeah.
Well, I mean, he's having... The quote is an existential crisis. And if we all haven't had them, maybe we just don't recognize it when it's happening to us, but it happens to all of us. And if you stick with what you love to begin with, as you continue to do it, oftentimes you remember why you loved it to begin with. And if you want to explore other possibilities and opportunities along the way, sometimes you make a change. Oftentimes you go back to what you love to begin with. You have to give it a chance. And I'd say, fine, if you want to change, change when you're sure you want to change. And when you have an opportunity to change too.
Right, so it almost feels too early to jump in. Okay, so I think we'll have a comment here and then here.
Yeah, I don't think he could continue as a cantor because he's representing the congregation davening. So he can't think of himself. I think he has to think of the people that he's representing. But he could teach. Well, he could be, he could teach the Hebrew school, he could teach trope, he could teach, prepare kids for bar mitzvah. So he could use his skills to make money, but not harm people in the way.
Right, so that's a really interesting perspective, which is, this isn't, he's not asking, is it hypocritical for me to show up at synagogue and daven for myself, but he's leading a congregation, he's taking their prayers to Hashem, and if he doesn't feel like he's the best messenger for that, your comment made me think about, I remember the first Yom Kippur during COVID when, the first Yom Kippur in my life, I wasn't in synagogue, I was in my house. And it suddenly occurred to me how much I was outsourcing the spirituality of the day to the cantor and to the community. Like, I never often, didn't prepare for Yom Kippur. You would just go to shul or synagogue and sit there, and the cantor would make the magic happen. And it was so interesting to have the first Yom Kippur where I was like, I have to do it myself. So I think it would have maybe been hard if you felt like the cantor was seeing this as a means to a livelihood or a performance and not as a religious experience. Yeah. Okay, so and then we'll have there, and then we'll have one last comment, and then, yeah.
So we're missing a few things in this story. One of the terms that we're seeing used here is non-believer.
Yeah.
He's a non-believer and he's clergy. And there's an actual teaching going on from clergy. That might be very difficult. But what we haven't talked about is when he talks about alternatives, none of them are singing. So if he's non-believer and he really doesn't like this public singing thing, he's gone.
Right, why persist? I mean, it also might be that, it's hard enough today to make and earn a living as a singer. So it might also just be that doesn't seem like such a viable alternative path. Though, gosh, when you read about what it was to be a peddler in those days too, it was hard work. Yeah.
Well, one thing that came to mind when you brought up the story was that he's obviously somebody who takes himself very seriously. And when you take yourself too seriously, I think you're setting yourself up for a crash. If he had thought that maybe he should explore his self-doubt first within his clerical role, and again, it's very hard to find something that you really love. Did he love being the Chazan, but yet he didn't believe in God? Was there something he could still do for his community? Can he discuss self-doubt with the members of his congregation or the people he met? And I always had that problem. I never tried to take myself too seriously because that always set me up for failure. If I said I have to reach this goal or that goal, I always felt it was better to be more flexible. And in that regard, he might become a layman, and then he might return to the clerical world later on. But he should have been open to exploring it with keeping an emotional path back to the clergy.
Like, this was similar. We don't have to see it as so black and white. And if he didn't feel like, oh no, I have these doubts, and it's just like, okay, you have doubts. It's okay, you'll do something else. Maybe it'd be a different feeling.
There's 3 or 4 more. Do you want to keep it going or switch?
We'll take one more, and then I think we'll move on. And then we'll look at a couple other questions that deal with similar issues. So I think we'll be able
I
to
have the
get
microphone, so I get to say it. So the way I looked at it is that
Last
I
call,
don't necessarily agree
Mark.
with this, but it could be a mercenary, right? I see benefit to helping my community, leading the community, even though I don't believe in what I am doing. Meaning, he sees the value, and he sees the spirit, and he sees the ruach that he helps create, and he can do that even if he doesn't believe it because he's helping others.
I want to go back to what Carol said, that she thought he should do what he was happiest doing. But I don't think that would have even occurred to him, or he could have even had that choice based on what we were told, the time and era of the 1913-16 period. He was raised in a world of obligation, and that was so ingrained in him that I don't think he could have left and been happy at any point in time just because of that. Isn't that what Judaism is partially all about? The obligation of what we need to do.
Right, there's, I think people are saying, well, he could have, there's space for non-believers and doubt, but I think at that time, right, this is really before we had options of reform or conservative or non-Orthodox synagogues, really before we had a diversity of Jewish options for people to go and explore those doubts. And so what I think is interesting is we see a number of different questions that deal with faith, and we see the editor often in times is sort of on the side of keeping open tradition when you can. But in this instance, our editor comes down, has a really clear, hard answer. So if you have it, you can read along with me. But so how do we answer our progressive cantor? This question would be answered by free thinkers as well as religious people in the same way. Even the rabbi would say that according to Jewish law, only a pious Jew may be a cantor. The man's wife and his religious friends who are trying to convince him to remain a cantor are really committing the worst sin according to their beliefs. For a non-believer to be a cantor for an Orthodox congregation is without a doubt a shameless hypocrisy. And I think the logic is very similar to what we were saying over here, which is that it's one thing if you're making a personal choice for yourself, and it's another thing if you're defrauding the congregation, right? And you're sort of leading in a way that is that people think they're kind of putting their religious stock in you. Because also, right, one thing is that if you don't take it so seriously yourself, it's much easier to cut corners. So I think a cantor who's up there who really feels the weight of them bringing this experience to the congregation, they're not going to be like, okay, people seem to be getting antsy, I'll just pretend I'm reading through this whole prayer. And there's an energy of how you can think about it when a cantor really feels that energy. So I remember when I first read this letter, my instinct was to say, no, listen, you have no other way to earn money. You have your doubts. And I was really chastened and I was really struck by the strength of the letter from this totally non-believing socialist editor there, which I will say was in strong contrast. So the next letter that we have here is another issue that I think a lot of people I know have kind of personally encountered, which is from somebody else who also identifies themselves. This is a 1908 letter, where somebody also identifies themselves as a socialist and as a free thinker. And they're debating with their friends about whether he is a mother who passed away, and he's debating whether it's acceptable for him to say Kaddish for his mother, even though in a similar situation, he's a socialist and a non-believer. And he said that one of his friends in his groups, the way he answers this question is that he hires somebody, he hires a pious Jew to instead say Kaddish for his mother. And then some of his friends say that he shouldn't go at all because it's hypocrisy. So I'm curious here, do people around the room feel a similar impulse as we did to our cantor, that if you're a non-believer, what are you doing saying Kaddish? Yeah. So right, so what we had here is like, yeah.
I think that it's important that the person that passed away wanted Kaddish to be said for them. Regardless of what you think, it doesn't matter. You're doing it for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, right, so there's this, and the editor comes in with a very similar view, which is that, right, honoring a departed one who is cherished and loved is a gracious sentiment and a requisite for the living. And everyone wants to be remembered after his or her death. So socialists and free thinkers alike, we observe the anniversaries of great leaders. Here he talks about how everyone recently was celebrating the 25th anniversary of the death of Karl Marx, which locates us at a different time in history. And saying Kaddish is a religious rite, and to pay someone to say Kaddish is not the act of a free thinker. So where he comes down here is that either you can basically decide that it doesn't make sense for you to go say Kaddish, or you can decide you're doing it to honor your parents. But to hire somebody else feels like this like quasi-escape route that is almost not honoring either position. Which, again, I think it's, there's a very interesting way in general in which saying Kaddish, sort of like having a wedding, comes up for a lot of people in an unexpectedly important role, even if somebody might have lived their whole life not so invested in religious ritual. So I remember one of the really saddest letters that I remember getting was somebody whose parents had not been religious. His father died, his dad wanted to be cremated, and he went along with it. And afterwards, his mother, who had grown up Orthodox and then hadn't been religious, started to have real regret about that decision. And he was writing to know how could he help her navigate her feelings that she had really done wrong against the body of her husband, right? And there's this interesting way where suddenly sometimes in these kind of big moments, who we are comes into relief in ways that can be very unexpected. So I think similarly when we were talking before about how you want to think about actions that leave the door open to changing how you feel, these questions about, should I say Kaddish, should I not? What are actions that are irrevocable, and what are actions that we can continue to persist? Yes. How did I respond to that letter? So it was, so I wrote back with a few follow-up questions, because I think as someone mentioned earlier, often you get letters and they're missing like a lot of information. So I wanted to know there what tradition his mom had grown up in, right? If she was a Moroccan Sephardic Jew, that can feel different than a, like Haredi European background. And essentially what it came down to was I talked about she loved her husband, she was doing what he wanted to do, and there's a long tradition in Jewish history of people whose bodies were burned, unwillingly, and of course we know that, God forbid, we would never think that they're now being excluded from the revival of the dead that will happen in the time of the Messiah. And the idea was, I think there was other religious rituals that you can do on behalf of somebody. So, for example, usually when a spouse dies, you only say, as we know, you only say Kaddish for usually 30 days. But in certain more tragic situations, when somebody dies, you can say Kaddish for up to 11 months, like you would for a parent. So I suggested that they were outside of the area of Shloshim. They could talk to the rabbi, but that it might help for his mom to feel that she could. And one of the reasons we say Kaddish is we help somebody whose body and soul is making that transition. So if she's worried that, or if she's really emotionally feeling like she's lost that intact body that, was so valued for her growing up, that maybe prolonging the time, maybe saying Kaddish for the full 11 months would feel like a way to spiritually help the person make that transition. Yeah. So one other area that comes up very strongly throughout these letters is the sort of the honestly really deep and tragic poverty. And I think we all viscerally, that the Jewish community faced when they came here. At all different points, right? There have been many different waves of Jewish immigration. And I think we all know these stories. A lot of us would have learned this in Jewish history, in Jewish history classes, in Jewish books we read from our own parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. But you see this real struggle then to deal, you see this real struggle in the letters to navigate how to deal with doing whatever you can to support your family while keeping the integrity of our Jewish soul. And I think about that today. We all have questions of how much do we have to kind of really fight back when we hear maybe a comment like that feels a little anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, maybe at work or somewhere else, and where does it make sense for us to just bite our tongue and not allow our Jewish identities to kind of sometimes always interfere with what we have to do. And I had two letters I remember that really struck me when I was thinking about this. So one is on page 5, and I'll read both of these. So I'll just give you an example of some of the working conditions that people were working with. And sometimes, right, I think my sister and I will often talk about this when we're struggling in life, and she'll be like, oh, this annoying thing happened at work. And it's like, when you think about what our ancestors persisted through, right, like all of us are here because of such strong people. And I think we've also, I'm sure many of us in this room have had to call upon so much strength. But here's another example. So I'm looking at page 5. Esteemed editor, we were sitting in the shop and working when the boss came over to one of us and said, you ruined the work and you'll have to pay for it. So people often worked piecemeal on projects. So this is a tailoring shop. The worker answered that it wasn't his fault and he had given the boss the work in perfect condition. You're trying to tell me. The boss got mad and began to shout, I pay your wages and you answer back, you dog. I should have thrown you out of my shop long ago. The worker trembled, his face got whiter, and when the boss noticed how his face had paled, he gestured, spat, and walked away. And the worker said no more. Tired and overcome with shame, he turned back to his work and later exclaimed, for 6 years I've been working here like a slave, and he tells me, you dog, I'll throw you out. I wanted to pick up an iron and smash his head in, but I saw before me my wife and 5 children who want to eat. Obviously, the offended man felt he had done wrong in not standing up for his honor as a worker and human being. In the shop, the machines hummed, the irons thumped, and we could see the tears running down his cheeks. Also, I'll just say, one of the most interesting things about these letters is even the factory workers, the men sweeping the streets, they have this amazing literary style, right? Like there's that Yiddish way with words. So even, right, the machines hummed, the irons thumped, we could see the tears running down his cheeks. Did this unfortunate man act correctly in remaining silent under the insults of his boss? Is the fact that he has a wife and children the reason for his slavery and refusal to defend himself? I hope you will answer my question. And here we see the editor, well, here we really see the socialist slant of the paper, right? He comes in strong. The worker cannot help himself alone. There is no limit to what must be done for a piece of bread. One must bite his lips till they bleed and keep silent when he is alone. But he must not remain alone. He must not remain silent. He must unite with his fellow workers and fight. To defend their honor as men, the workers must be well organized. There's no attempts at objective neutrality here. But we have a series of questions, right? And they're often like helping people organize how to be union workers. So we have a series of questions, right, which are people saying like, you know, how much do I have to go to defend myself? And they're saying there's no limit to what you can do when you have a family that needs to eat, right? And I think we can all identify with that. But in some ways, there really are limits. And I think for all of us, negotiating what those limits are very interesting. So, oh, great. Okay, we have some time. So I think there's one more question that I'd love for us to look at as a group. And I'll read it out loud. This one is on page 3 of the handout, if people want to refer to it. But I want to, this is one that I'm very curious to hear what people will think. I'll read it out loud, and then we'll, again, spend a little bit of time talking about it, because I think it goes to what do we do when we're desperate, and what are those limits? So, worthy editor. I was born in Russia of poor parents, and when quite young, I went to Vilna to study at the Romalis Yeshiva, which was a very prominent, very Orthodox yeshiva in Vilna. Later, I studied at yeshiva in Kovno. I ate days at other people's tables. So the idea of eating days is so yeshiva students would often be assigned to go, like they'd have people in the area who would host them, and that's how you got access to food. So you would have dinner. So it'd be like Wednesday night at this person's house, Thursday night at that person's house. So it was called eating a day. But I often went hungry because there was many times when I only ate 3 days a week. So you only had 3 weekly invitations. So that means there's 4 days a week where you're not eating. When I was 18, I came home to my parents. Because I had been listed through an era as a few years older, I was due to be drafted for military service. So it was decided that I go to America. So I went to America. In time, I married a girl who was as lonely as I, and we were happy even though I made a meager living. When our big mouth workers' liberator, Teddy Roosevelt, was elected for his 2nd term, it got so bad that I couldn't find a job. We had 5 children by then and no money coming in. At that time, I became a janitor, and for the work, I was given 2 dark rooms on Stanton Street where the sun was ashamed to shine. I know, right? The phrases. Once when I went to look out for work, I unexpectedly met a man with whom I had studied years ago in Vilna. I was thin as a rail, but he had a strong neck, a fat belly, and was well-dressed. I asked him what his occupation was, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he invited me to his home and there told me that if I wanted to, I could be as well off as he. You're going to have, trust me, you might think you know where this is going, and you're definitely not guessing where it's going. In short, he told me that he was a Christian missionary and got $175 a month, not counting gifts. I was in a tight spot and let him talk me into it. So for some just context and background, in the early 1900s, this became a kind of, I don't even know what to call it, not like a multi-marketing scheme, but a way to make money was that this was very popular in the South in like Baptist church or Methodist churches, where they would promote these events like a Jew who found Jesus, right? And they would have people come in from all over, from all the surrounding churches, and you would get paid very well. You never actually were trying to convert Jews to Christianity, but what you were often doing is like you were kind of being like displayed as like the token Jew who found Jesus, and you would go around and talk about this, and this was kind of a big scourge in the community. So he gets talked into this, right? And he says, when my wife, who was religious, found out that I had become a missionary, she didn't want to know me any longer. I was sent, so she kicks him out of the house. I was sent to do my work elsewhere and got no news from my wife and children. I cannot demand sympathy from my wife because I do not deserve it. but I hope you will print my letter. Maybe my wife will read it and perhaps at least let me know where she is and how my living orphans are, because I would like to help them out. I also hope that my letter will serve as a warning to others to beware of making the terrible mistake I made. So this is another example, by the way, of how the Bintel brief was often used as like an advertisement to communicate to people. So you also have what's known as the gallery of missing husbands. So it was very common at that time. Men would often come over from Russia with a wife, many children, and then would feel the call of the West, right? We're in freedom and not 6 people dependent on you, and they would flee. And you would have these letters of people just being like, Max, where are you? You've left me with the children. And the forward would publish these letters as an attempt to shame the men. And often people would find them. There's this great letter that I didn't bring here, where this woman's in Russia, and she says, like, I've been writing letters to my husband who was supposed to send for me and the children. He's not writing back. And now he's stopped answering all my letters. So she writes to the Bintel brief, and they find a local rabbi who writes letters to her rabbis, and essentially they find the man, and they call him into and they bring the woman over to America. They call in the man as under a different pretext, and when he walks in, his wife and 5 kids from Russia are there. And it turns out he had found another wife in America. So then he gets sent to prison, and the letter she had organized all of this between the rabbis from Russia to America, which is just like, I mean, at least for me, you know, you sometimes think like, how did people do things before cell phones? And this all got organized. And she's writing the letter to the Bintel brief because she feels so guilty for this new wife, because now her husband's in prison and can't support her. And she's like, I'm doing okay. She's making money as a seamstress, and she's trying to figure out what to do. But so this was often a way that people would advertise. So, all right, I was going to say we can break off into small groups. Maybe we'll just do this as a discussion. I'm just curious for people here. So we have this man who is in desperate poverty and starts to work as a Christian missionary. His wife finds out. His wife leaves him, refuses to even hear from him again. And he wants to know, what can he do? He clearly wants to get back in touch with them. So I'm curious, who here feels like their impulse is to forgive him? No sympathy. Okay. Yeah, well, I'll take one comment there. Oh, you have the impulse to forgive him. Okay, you don't have to. And we have Benny.
So the thing that strikes me as interesting about this is he did this to earn money, presumably for his family, who are now not benefiting from the money he's making. And you have to ask yourself, why does he persist in doing this? He could quit doing it, go back to being a janitor, and his kids would probably have more money than they do now when they don't have any money.
Right. And so I guess we don't know from the letter, like, he seems very remorseful. So he says, right, I cannot demand sympathy from my wife because I don't deserve it. I hope my letter is a warning to others. So he might have quit, but you raised the good point also, which clearly his wife had somewhere to go with the kids. So you do wonder, did the family really explore all options before he even made this decision? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel that there should be room for forgiveness. I mean, he recognizes that he made a mistake. I mean, in his poverty, he saw that was a way out, and then he recognized, no, I lost myself in the process, and that's not worth it. So asking for forgiveness, I think yes, there should be some reconciliation. And he seems to be ready for that. I mean, he writes that he wants to warn people not to do the same mistake as I have done. So, I mean, he has come around himself recognizing that this was not good. But in a desperate situation, who knows what you do?
Right, and he was thinking about his family, and he does seem remorseful, right? And the reason I was thinking about it in conjunction with the letter we read right before is, right, the sympathy there of there's no limit to what someone must do for a piece of bread. And if you're going to say that, we then have to really think about, like, what are those limits and what are decisions? Yeah. All right, well, Mark, we have one.
I was thinking I agree with Benny, and then I'm thinking today how people inappropriately use apology. I guess I'm thinking politically, you see politician with all the cameras apologize with his wife standing next to him for his indiscretion, and he did a wrong thing. He's begging forgiveness. He wants to come back. And so that sort of colors my mind in terms of, I guess, the motivation for wanting forgiveness. Is it, I think in politicians in terms of power or whatever, but maybe one has to look at why they're asking for forgiveness. Is it for their own self or also for their family, that they can continue to help?
Right, is this a case of you're sorry for what you did or you're sorry that you got caught? Which is, right, and there's a sense here, that's right, we get the sense that he really misses his wife and kids, but we're not, but he doesn't talk about his yeshiva days fondly, right? He was hungry, he didn't have enough to eat. You get the sense that maybe he's not so sorry for what he did, but he's pretty sorry that he's lost his wife and family. Yeah, last comment, and then we'll. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm overriding the system.
In Judaism, we believe in teshuvah. And if he is, I was thinking, if you take it away from religion, what if he had decided to join a mob or rob a bank? He was desperate and he was looking for something to raise money for his family, and he made a choice that was morally incorrect, just like all of those would be. And if he was sincerely apologetic, then I think she should understand that.
Right, if he's really apologetic, there's an open avenue for forgiveness. But it is interesting, right? So you wonder even if she might have been easier for her to forgive him if he had robbed a bank, right, or joined a mob. There's something about the religious element that can feel uniquely egregious, right, when you cross a sacred act. I think about this. So as a religion reporter, I'm often in situations, right, where you're kind of like a neutral face. You're interviewing people, and you're not supposed to have opinions about what they're telling you, right? You're just gathering the facts and information. So sometimes that will mean I'm in religious settings where, the appropriate thing to do is to acquiesce to what is expected of you of your host, right? So that might mean, kissing the hand of a Coptic monk. That might mean, giving like a symbolic bow of respect to a statue of Buddha. And there's like lines that I've been comfortable navigating. But the one time I remember I was in Israel, I was working on a story about the Hebrew-speaking Catholics of Israel. So these are Israelis who, a lot of them come from families where in the Soviet Union, when a lot of after the Russian and Polish families came over, you often had Jewish Russian men married to these pious Catholic wives from Ukraine. And they wanted their kids baptized, and they wanted to raise them Catholic. And you also have a lot of there's a growing Filipino community in Israel, and a lot of them are Catholic. So you have these kids, and it's fascinating, right? Because they're in the army, they go to public school, and there's all these programs to be like, how do you keep them Christian in such a Jewish world, right? And it's so sad for them because, when Hanukkah's everywhere, they feel really left out when they're trying to celebrate Christmas, and and it's also amazing to talk because all of the Christian theology and terms has to be spoken in Hebrew. So I was at this summer camp near Beit Shemesh for Catholic children. They were 5. And I forget what I was asking them. They had been acting out a story from the Gospel of John. So I said something about, the Gospel of John. And they looked at each other, and then one said to me, Yochanan HaTzadik, Yochanan the Tzaddik, because that's how you say St. John in Hebrew. But so I was interviewing this one guy who runs the Christian cemetery. Has anyone here been to Emek Rephaim in Jerusalem? So it's one of the main streets in Jerusalem. And there's this big cemetery called the Tantur, and it's the Tantur Cemetery. And it's always closed, so you might never notice it. But when it's open, you can walk in, and it's run by this ex-Haredi man from Bnei Brak who had a vision of Jesus and now runs the Christian cemeteries in Israel. And he told me that there's a monastery, a Poor Clare monastery up the road, where the nuns are totally cloistered, but do a lot of internal kind of advocacy work about different issues. And he said, okay, and he's the one who goes up and delivers things to them. He said, I can bring you into the nuns. And I was like, oh my gosh, no reporter has ever gotten access to this monastery in like 20 years. That would be like so cool. He's like, yes, you just have to tell them that you believe in Jesus. And we talked earlier about like doubt and things, and I'll tell this, like, right, like I'm definitely not the most pious person I know. And so I definitely had a moment where I was like, it would be so cool to do that story. But then I thought about all my ancestors, you know, God, like so many people in our history like lost their lives rather than say that. I was like, I obviously can't say. I was like, you know, and then I was like, you know, there's just no way around this. So I did not get the story. But sometimes when there's a religious line, it can kind of hit your heart in a different way and a little bit closer to what we think about. Sorry, now I just totally lost my train of thought there because, did we have one more? No. Okay. Sure, yeah, you can get one more comment. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
First of all, Cheryl, I want to thank you for an extraordinary weekend. The weekend was beyond my expectations, and I had high expectations for your presence here. For those who've missed it, I've actually seen the video of these recordings that were made during the weekend. So for those who want deja vu or want to share this with their friends, their family, their children, their grandchildren in the world, I invite them to go to YouTube and to look at the YouTube presentations that took place today and yesterday. This could be the subject of a book, and if it is, I want to be at your book signing. Maybe all of us be there at your book signing if you write this book or other books. So to be careful, I actually wrote out the question so I would get it accurately. How did your student experience at Yale University and Harvard Divinity School affect your view of Judaism and other religions? Again, this could be the subject of an incredible book, but I'd like to hear a preview of the book if you're ever going to write it right now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alan, and thank you so much for your kind words. This has been a really fun weekend. So basically spending time at Yale and at Harvard, which I think are pretty similar to a lot of other schools, influenced my view of Judaism. I think for many of us, well, so I'll say for me, right, I grew up in a very diverse but totally Jewish world, right? I went to a Jewish day school. I went to Jewish summer camps. I think like all my parents' friends are Jewish, everyone I knew. I remember I have this vivid memory, and then I spent some time, 2 years learning in Israel before I went to college. I always joke that probably if I had been born a man, I would have gone kind of like the Haredi, like learn all day. I'd be in Mea Sharm now with 18 children, because I had that sort of pious instinct in me as a child. But I think God was like, okay, there's other plans for you, so we're going to cut off that path. But I have this very vivid memory of my first week at Yale, taking out my cell phone, no, still like those flip phones, and scrolling through the contacts list to see if I had like a single non-Jewish person in my entire phone book, right? Because I suddenly, and I didn't think of myself as that sheltered. I grew up in Manhattan. We went to plays and the opera, and I was, I thought I was super cultured, like most 18-year-olds. And, and it was one of those, it was a Jewish day school, but parents certainly wanted their kids to go to Ivy League schools and work in the professional world. So it hadn't even occurred to me that I was sheltered. And then I realized it was like, I was like looking at my phone book, and I was like, I guess my dentist isn't Jewish, which is weird enough. Most dentists are. So I think, in a funny way, I think there's two ways where I actually feel somewhat grateful, or I feel like what it set me up was that I lived in a world where I felt just so 100% comfortable with being Jewish that when somebody questioned the identity, it didn't feel to me like something that could shake me. It more felt confusing. So I remember I was in Israel when I was still living in Israel. A friend and I decided to tramp down to Petra to go into. Has anyone done this? You go into Jordan, you go to So we had spent the night in Eilat, and we would have been 18, 17, and we had hitchhiked the whole way down. And actually, just one thing I remember from that very strongly was that it was Hanukkah, and we had lit the menorah in the subway station at midnight when we'd finally caught a bus. And when we started singing, and there was a bunch of people who were homeless sleeping in the subway, in the train station, and when we lit the blessing and started reciting the blessing, all the homeless people joined in because they were all Jewish. And it was just such a strange reminder of what it means to be in Israel, right? And to be singing, lighting the Hanukkah blessings. It's a really strong memory that I have. But we had, gotten to a lot. We'd gotten dropped off by our last person who'd picked us up. And, like two 17-year-olds, we found the cheapest motel we could find. And the people were it was kind of like a bed and breakfast. They were very nice. And they invited us that evening to come sit around the fire. There was like a fire pit. And I get there, and it's a bunch of African Americans from North Carolina, and people are wearing Jewish stars. And also I noticed some crosses, but I don't think a lot about it. And then someone gives me a Bible and says, hey, can you read Isaiah 53 out loud? And I was like, Isaiah, whoever gets to the end of the book of Isaiah, it's so long, right? So Isaiah 53, well, as you'll soon find out, is like a very important passage in the Christian community. But, I'd never met a Christian before. So I'm like, sure. So we read Isaiah 53, and it's all about, this is the passage of the suffering servant. So it's the passage that talks about how God is going to send a servant to suffer on behalf of the world and die for our sins. And it's very clear, as I was reading it, like even I was able to put together that this had like a Jesus undertone happening. And so I finished reading this passage, and maybe these 8 or 9 people who are in the hostel very earnestly look at me and they're like, so how do you think this is not about Jesus? And I remember my first instinct and feeling was just like rachmanis, like compassion, because I was like, oh my God, I don't want to tell you that I don't think about Jesus at all, right? They were like they wanted me to have at least to debate them on their terms because this was clearly so important to them. And I was just like, oh, I'm so sorry, we never think about you. You're just not on my radar. So I think my experience at Yale and Harvard was really eye-opening to think about, what does it mean to have to push Judaism in the public spaces, and also what are the ways that the Jewish community is self-sufficient. And I don't know that I've perfectly navigated that. I'm sometimes probably err more on the side of, not always being my full Jewish self in non-Jewish spaces. It's one of the reasons it's been so lovely. Often I'm invited to speak in media context as a reporter, and it was so beautiful for me this weekend to be able to speak as a Jew. And I think that's something I'm still trying to navigate and learn. Okay, so I know we just have another minute, so we had one more really fun question, but maybe I'll leave that as a good taste for you. I'll give you an overview, and then I'll wrap us up together. Because I think, right, so just to wrap up in this last point, and then I'll give us a wrap up for this morning. Etiquette columns and advice columns often burst onto the scene at moments of social change because there are times when people, somehow what they've picked up from home is not adequate to teach them how to navigate in the world. So in the Victorian era is when in kind of the 1800s is when we first see this explosion of books of etiquette. Because what you have for the first time is sort of a rising wealthy middle class and also a rising wealthy sort of business class of people who are now socializing at kind of aristocratic and other spaces that they wouldn't have been before, and they don't know how to act, right? What am I supposed to wear? How am I supposed to eat? There's a whole complicated system with mourning rules, letter writing rules, and people don't really know how to navigate that. And so you have all these books of advice. You see this also, I'll say, in the Jewish community. So there's been some very fascinating articles written about the fact that in the Orthodox world has, since the 1990s, become more orthodox, a little bit more rigid. I remember being struck by this, when I looked at my dad's high school yearbook. He went to the yeshiva of Flatbush, which was a totally Orthodox school in the 1960s, I think, or 50s. No, I think he graduated high school in 68 or something. He was born in 1948. Anyway, 60s. And I'm looking through their yearbook, and they had a cheerleading team, and the girls are wearing cheerleading uniforms, right, with mini skirts and the whole thing, which would have never happened in my Orthodox high school. And my dad was like, yeah, that was totally normal. And I did a project once at a much more Orthodox girls' school near me. So in high school, I got to spend a month there as a student. I don't remember why they let me do that. And looking through the yearbooks too, in the 70s, you see everyone's wearing these kind of cap sleeves and these dresses. And so one of the reasons that people think the Orthodox world has sometimes shifted to a little bit of a more rigidity is in the 1990s, you get groups of people who are suddenly becoming more interested in their Jewish heritage, but they weren't necessarily raised by Orthodox parents. And so they learn how to be Orthodox not from their mother or their grandmother in the kitchen who's like, you can do that. This is how you keep a kosher kitchen, but from books of law. And books don't really respond to the reality of like the human situation, right? And so when you read something in a book, you see this is black and white. We talked about this earlier. And with that like rigidity of the written word, suddenly the ability to be flexible is like no longer as prevalent. So what I think is very interesting in the Bintel brief is that it's one of the, and I love advice columns, I have read so many different specialized ones, is that it deviates a little bit from this pattern where it becomes something more of a literary phenomenon and a narrative, which is one reason I think the reading them is so interesting. And so you see these different stories that come up not to teach Jews how to act, and they very rarely prescribe a certain way that like one must act. Except, we saw a few cases today where they come down pretty hard. But in general, they're constantly, it was run by fiction writers, and they're always looking for a story. So I'll just describe to you one more letter we had here, which was a woman who falls in love with a man in Russia, and they're getting married, and the morning of her wedding, he calls her in, and he says, "I'm so sorry, I can't go through with it." And she's like, "The guests are all here, what is going on?" And he's like, "Listen, in my youth, I met a woman, and I fell in love with her, and she's the love of my life. And she went to America, and I never heard from her again, but I promised her my heart." And so she says, "I promised him, listen, if you ever find this woman again, like, you can keep your promise to her, but, like, for right now, just come under the chuppah. Like, it'll be fine." Years go by, they get married, they have, thank God, many children, they move to America. And she writes the Bintel brief, and she says, "Last week, my husband came home, white-faced and trembling. And he said, 'Do you remember the morning of the wedding, the promise you made me?' And she says, 'I fainted, and for 3 days, I didn't come to my senses.'" It was a very dramatic time in literary Jewish moments. She says, "When I finally came to my senses, he said that he had found the girl, he had found the woman, and all the feelings had come back, and he had promised it to her, and he needs to now be released from their marriage and all their children so that he can go off with this woman." Who here feels sympathy for the husband? I'll admit, so I'll say when I first came across this column, okay, good, we'll wrap up in 2 minutes. When I first came across this column, I think when I was like in high school, and I was younger, I was like, that's so romantic. Like, I was 14, right? And I was like, what? They're still in love? Like, how is she being so mean and stopping this true love story? And I had this memory of that when I was reading these letters again. I was teaching these in a class that I teach at CUNY. And I was like, oh yeah, and the editor is like hilariously like, yeah, the man cannot leave his wife and children for a woman who he's like, by the way, it sounds like this woman has made no effort to find him in the past 10 years, right? But the column becomes famous for having these really dramatic like soap opera letters and stories that come in. So one of the reasons, and I'll just wrap up here, and it was so fun to talk about some of these with you guys, is that I think, it can feel sometimes like as we face issues as a Jewish community, that they can feel a little unprecedented or challenging, and it can make us really worry about the future. And there's something when we go back and look at like over 100 years, 1908 was more than 100 years ago, of Jews writing in questions and feeling like, what do I do with doubts and faith? Who am I supposed to marry? What kind of family should I raise? And we didn't look at them today, but there's so many questions about real anti-Semitism, real discrimination in the workplace. And I think it reminds us that these are not new questions, that we were all born with such resilient Jews. This has been such a lovely weekend.
So thank you all for coming today. It was the 4th talk, and we've been inspired every time, Shira. So thank you for bringing your sparkling personality and your joy for what you discussed to us. And here is a small token, safe travels. Everybody, we're going to do benching in a little bit, and then stay around to help out and clean up. Again, big thank you to Mark and Randy Cohen for managing the kitchen, and everybody else for doing everything for Scholar Residence Weekend, and thank you, Shira.
Yashikoach. That was inspiring and exciting to listen to. Beautiful. So we're going to take up the blue books in the middle of your table and start to page. What? Thank you. 64, 63, 62 is a shortened version of Birkat Hamazon. Page 62. It's not bingo, it's just page 62. So, we are ready. No rabbi here? Chavrai nevarech. Yehi Shem Adonai Barachmata ve'ad olam b'yeshut. Chavrai nevarech Eloheinu shachalnu mishelom. Baruch Eloheinu shachalnu mishelom. Uvetovo chayinu. Baruch hu baruch shemo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hazan et haolam kolo betovo v'chein b'chesed uvrachamim rachamim unoten lechem lechol basar ki leolam chasdo uvtovo hagadol Tami lo chazalanu ve'al yechzalanu mazon leolam va'ed ba'avur shemo hagadol ki ozanu farnes lakol umetiv lakol lo mechin mazon lechol b'riotav asher bara baruch atah Adonai Hazan et hakol Node lecha Adonai Eloheinu Al shenichalta lavoteinu eretz chemda tova urchava Berit v'torah chayim u'mazon Yitbarach shimcha b'fi chol chai Tamid le'olam va'ed Kakatu v'yachalta v'savata u'verachta Et Adonai Elohecha Al haaretz hatova shenatan lach, Baruch atah Adonai, Al haaretz ve'al hamazon, U'v'nei Yerushalayim, Ir hakodesh b'mira ve'yameinu, Baruch atah Adonai, Boneh v'rachamav, Yerushalayim, Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Hatov ve'hameitiv lakol, U'heitiv, u'meitiv, u'yeitiv lanu, U'gem lanu, u'gem leinu, yigmel leinu la'ad. Chen v'chesed v'rachamim, v'zakeinu limot hamashiach. Harachamanu yivarech et haaretz asot v'yagen aleha. Harachamanu yivarech et ha'cheinu b'nei Yisrael, chanetonim v'tzara, v'yotzi'em mi'afala le'oram. Harachaman Yavarech et Medinat Yisrael Reshit Smichat Geolateinu. Turn to page 67. V'nisa v'rachameit Adonai utztakam Elohei Yisheinu v'nimstachein v'sechel tov v'einu Elohim v'adam ose shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imeru. Amen. It's Mark. I give you the words to Mark. For one of the Marks. The Marks brothers. Are we done? We done? Okay. All right.
I'm done.
All right, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Benny. And if you want to be more involved with Men's Club or get involved with planning for next year, sign up with Mark Zuckerman. Oh, yeah, and please help clean up.